The consumer, that's you, always bears the cost. Now, I need you to remember that because it's going to come up over and over and over the course of the next several minutes. Let's talk about tariffs, or what I like to call tariffs, and whether you're about to pay a whole lot more at the electronics store. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Caleb Dennison, and I know a lot of folks are wondering right now, are consumer electronics, and especially TVs, about to get a whole lot more expensive? Maybe, but also maybe not. Today, I want to talk about tariffs and the many different ways this could all play out. Now, first, I want to get out in front of something right away. This is not a political post, or at least it's not politically motivated. I will be talking about how politics and economics intersect, and we'll talk about political strategies and different policy possibilities. But at the end of the day, this is about the calculus involved in a number of potential scenarios, some of which could end in consumer electronics, and specifically TVs, getting more expensive, possibly a lot more expensive. Look, the reason we're having this discussion is what I'm going to call a terror over tariffs, a fear that tariffs automatically mean higher prices on some of the stuff that we buy, especially stuff that already tends to be pretty expensive. But in order to understand how this could all play out, we need to speak some truth to how tariffs actually work, how they affect supply chains, costs, and pricing, and when they can and can't be used as a tool, a means to an end. So let's start with the basics. A tariff is essentially a tax on imported goods. The idea behind it is pretty simple. If the US government slaps a tariff on a product coming into the country from another country, it forces the company importing that product to pay a fee. Let me repeat that last bit. It forces the company importing that product, not the company making it, to pay an added fee. Put like that, it sounds pretty straightforward, right? But here's where the misunderstanding happens. Based on what I'm seeing on social media, it seems like a lot of folks assume that tariffs are paid by the foreign company selling us the goods. And that's not how it works. In reality, US companies importing those products are the ones who pay the tariff. And guess what? They're not just going to eat that cost. They're going to pass it on to retailers, who will then pass it on to you, the consumer. Like I said, the consumer always bears the cost. Let's take a second to put that in real terms. Say there's a new tariff on TVs imported from Mexico. Lots of companies based in Asia actually use Mexican manufacturing. So when the TV comes into the US, it comes in from Mexico, even if the TV brand is from China or South Korea. Now, if a US retailer like Best Buy buys a TV from a manufacturer overseas and suddenly has to pay an extra 10% tariff on that TV, you know what happens next? That 10% cost gets added to the final price of the TV, which you pay at the register. Now, some companies do absorb some of the cost to try and stay competitive, but only to an extent. Over time, the burden almost always makes its way to you, the buyer. In a moment, I'm going to talk about how tariffs are often used as a bargaining chip in negotiation tactics. But before I do that, let's talk about why else a tariff might be imposed on something. One common justification that we hear is protecting domestic industries by making foreign goods more expensive. The idea here is that it would give US-based manufacturers a competitive advantage, right? If imported goods cost more, companies will have a stronger incentive to produce similar products right here in the US. If the cost difference isn't that much, buy American, right? But there's a fundamental problem with that idea. Little to no consumer electronics are made in the US, and it is well understood that moving large-scale manufacturing back to the US, or just starting it in the US, isn't as simple as imposing tariffs. If you want to be made in the USA, you've got to build factories, create new supply chains, and this one is huge. Hire a workforce. All of that is proven to take years, if not decades. And then there's the issue of labor costs. The reason companies moved manufacturing overseas in the first place is because it is significantly cheaper in countries like Mexico and Vietnam, where labor costs are a fraction of what they are here in the United States. So while some policymakers argue that tariffs can lead to more domestic production, the caveat is that this would take an immense amount of time to happen, if it happened at all. And if it did, the cost of goods would be far more expensive than they are now. And here's the evidence to support that. We've seen attempts to move manufacturing back to the US before, and most of them didn't go as planned. A great example is Foxconn's failed Wisconsin LCD factory. In 2017, Foxconn, you know Foxconn, they make a lot of Apple stuff. Well, Foxconn announced plans for a massive LCD manufacturing plant in Wisconsin, with the promise of about 13,000 American jobs. Fast forward to today, that plant never became the large-scale factory that it was supposed to be. It's basically a network and data center that employs just shy of 1,500 people. It went from a multi-billion-dollar project to just under a $650 million project. Now, Foxconn cited cost issues and shifting economic realities as the reason for its demise, but they got massive tax cuts to get it to where it is today. So, did we win? Did Wisconsin win? I'm glad to hear that there are 1,500 more jobs than there were before, but no, that did not go as it was supposed to go. Cost issues and shifting economic realities, they said. Half of that is labor costs. Labor costs are a huge factor. In fact, I'd argue that they are the biggest factor. I mean, to put that into perspective a little bit, the average manufacturing wage in Mexico is around $4 per hour, while in the US, it's closer to $25 per hour. That kind of wage difference makes it difficult for companies to justify any kind of large-scale manufacturing in the US when they can produce goods for a fraction of the cost somewhere else. So while tariffs might encourage some companies to rethink their supply chains, the idea of mass US manufacturing making a comeback it's just extremely unlikely. Instead, companies will look to shift operations to Vietnam or India or Malaysia, places that already have an established manufacturing infrastructure. Now, I suppose you could argue that tariffs would raise prices on TVs and other electronics so much that they would be about as expensive for us to buy as the more expensive electronics made here in the United States. But I don't think the maths out in favor of that argument. I think the domestic products, stuff made here, would still be significantly more expensive. Tariffs just aren't the leveling the playing field tool, not in that way. They can help counter artificially low prices created by foreign manufacturers, the kind that are designed to gut foreign economies. And I think that's where the notion that tariffs are a great equalizer comes from. But in this context, tariffs are not going to do that. No, what's more likely is businesses will take the more immediate and cost-effective route, shift their operations to another low-cost country, not being tariffed, instead of trying to build something in the United States. But with all of that said, it's possible that isn't the end game for the current administration's tariff threats. What if tariffs are just a big bargaining chip in this game of negotiating something else? That's right, another reason tariffs get imposed or even just threatened is as a bargaining chip. The current administration has already made moves on tariffs related to Taiwan-made semiconductors, chips. And there have also been threats of tariffs on goods from China, Mexico, and Canada. But are these threats just talk, or is there an actual long-term plan to use them as leverage in negotiations? We've seen before, recently, that the US government has threatened tariffs only to walk them back later in exchange for better trade deals. The idea is to pressure other countries into offering better trade agreements or concessions on manufacturing, labor, or technology sharing policies. Here's a recent example of just such a thing. In 2018 and 2019, there were tariffs placed on goods from China, which affected everything from washing machines to circuit boards. Some companies adjusted their supply chains while others waited for negotiations to play out. And some of those tariffs were eventually reduced or flat out eliminated through trade deals. So could that happen again right now? Absolutely. But the big question is how companies will react this time. I mean, once you know your opponent's tell, once you know they're bluffing or have some ulterior motive, well, you might play the game differently. We know from history that when tariffs do go into effect, companies don't just sit back and take the hit. They look for workarounds, loopholes. And one of the most popular strategies is to move manufacturing to avoid the tariffs entirely. Just go to a different country. For TV specifically, a lot of production happens in China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Mexico. So if tariffs hit those countries, what's the alternative? Well, some companies might shift assembly to Vietnam, India, or Malaysia, places that already have some manufacturing infrastructure, like I said before. Honestly, that makes way more sense than to suddenly start making TVs in the United States. But there's another positive consequence of that. See, we don't want all of our goods made in just a handful of pockets across the globe. Think of it this way. If all the world's zippers were made in Japan, and parenthetically, many of them are, just check your zippers. I bet most of them say YKK on them. But say Japan suffered another natural disaster and it managed to wipe out zipper manufacturing entirely. That would be a huge hit to the supply chain for clothing, and that would create mass chaos. We need zippers to be made in as many different countries as possible across the globe. It's good for competition, it's good for supply chain, it's just a good idea. So I'm actually into the idea of TVs being made in more countries, but this idea that we could make TVs in the US, again, extremely unlikely. Manufacturing TVs in the US would be incredibly expensive compared to overseas. Labor costs are higher, the infrastructure isn't set up for mass TV production, and companies can't just build new facilities overnight. Moving a factory to another country that already has a supply chain and the factory buildings, that's doable. Moving it to the US, guys, it's not gonna happen. So as I mentioned before, we've seen cases where a tariff was threatened but never actually happened. Remember, just in 2019, the presidential administration at the time announced new tariffs on consumer electronics from China. Those were expected to include laptops and smartphones and game consoles, but after pushback from tech companies and trade partners, the tariffs were delayed and then eventually scaled back. Instead of broad tariffs, trade agreements were made and the problem just kind of went away. This kind of scenario is important to keep in mind. Just because a tariff is proposed doesn't mean it will actually happen. And even if it does, it may not be as extreme as we're fearing it would be. That's why I think we have to adopt a wait and see attitude here. Threats don't always turn into actual tariffs. Just because a tariff has been proposed doesn't mean it's gonna happen, or if it does, that it's gonna stick around for very long. Also, if it does, companies are gonna adapt. Some are gonna shift manufacturing. Some will just absorb the costs, and some will find loopholes. That doesn't mean prices won't go up. It just means it's not as simple as tariff goes up, price skyrockets. I mean, guys, we've been here before. When past administrations have imposed tariffs, there was a lot of fear about massive price increases. Some of that happened, but not to the extreme that people feared. Companies made adjustments, deals were struck, and eventually things stabilized. So what's the takeaway here? Well, we don't know exactly what's going to happen yet. But what we do know is that if tariffs go into effect, consumers will feel it in some way, whether that's higher prices, fewer choices, or manufacturers shifting operations. I think the best thing to do right now is watch closely and be ready. If you're in the market for a new TV right now, well, honestly, I would suggest that you buy right now. Not just because of the tariff scare, but because now is one of the best times to buy a TV in the normal TV product cycle. But considering we don't know if prices are gonna go up, that's just more incentive to go ahead and punch that buy button. If you're not ready to do that now, well, keep an eye on whether these tariffs actually materialize. And if they do, expect to see some price hikes before long. I mean, prices on TVs won't be announced until March and April from most brands. They still have time to jack those prices up to hedge against the threat of tariffs. In fact, I've seen companies shift their pricing up or down the day before the pricing is officially announced. So they'll probably wait until the last second to make a decision if they have to. Anyway, that's what tariffs actually are, and that's how they get used and what kind of impact they might have on you. What do you think? Do you think these tariffs are coming? And if so, how do you think companies are gonna respond? Drop a comment below, because I'd love to hear your take on it. And hey, if you like this video, would you do me a favor and smash that like button? Subscribe if you want to see more, ring that notification bell so you know when I come out with a new video. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you on the next one, and until then, here's 2 other videos I think you might like. Forgot something I said.